Welcome to the IWP podcast, coming to you live from the Institute of World Politics in Washington, D.C. I'm Jim Robbins, Dean of Academics at IWP, an accredited graduate school of national security, intelligence, and international affairs, offering a variety of certificates, master's degrees, and doctorates, both in person and online. You can check out our programs and our courses at our website, iwp.edu. I want to talk about the mythology, the reality, and the strategy behind the ongoing protests on college campuses. The student radicals turning out in droves to protest for Palestine seem to believe, even expect, that their organized mass demonstrations will somehow foment revolutionary change. They are inspired by the example of the 1960s. The civil rights marchers and Vietnam War protesters are their muses. These were the heroes of the progressive narrative who put their bodies on the line, facing fire hoses and club-wielding cops to bend the arc of history towards good. At least that's the myth the students have been taught, sometimes by aged 60s and 70s protesters themselves, or student activists who morphed into professors and never left campus for the real world. The 60s myth was written by the liberal generation of scholars who took part in these demonstrations, so it's no wonder that they exaggerated their impact. However, then as now, disruptive protests are never particularly popular, and there is little evidence that the 1960s demonstrations had the impact that liberal historians later claimed. Protesters regard the civil rights movement as the gold standard of civic activism, based on the Civil Rights Act and other legislation that followed. But the public perception of the various civil rights marches was not so positive. Polling taken after the 1963 March on Washington, the I Have a Dream March, showed 60% disapproved, many saying such marches would cause violence and would not accomplish anything. And in the 7 years after the march, there were as many as 700 urban riots, the worst being in Detroit, Los Angeles, Newark, and Washington, D.C. Martin Luther King was not yet a widely admired figure. A July 1964 poll showed him towards the bottom of the list of most respected Americans, while now reviled FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover was at the top by a wide margin. And in fact, MLK became less popular over time, with a 1966 Gallup poll showing a 66% unfavorable rating, down from 37% unfavorability 3 years earlier. This all changed, of course, after King's tragic assassination in 1968, and history has been kind to Dr. King's efforts because the civil rights movement was at its core aspirational, a call to national self-betterment that could appeal to all citizens. The movement sought to unite people behind a righteous American cause, that of equality under the law. And the message was specifically crafted to be pro-American. The 1965 Selma marchers carried the American flag and sang the Star-Spangled Banner. This is a far cry from today's angry protesters who vandalize George Washington's statue, burn the flag, and say death to America. Martin Luther King wanted to open up the American dream. Today's progressives invoke Malcolm X and his angry view of the American nightmare. Then there's the widespread belief that massive student protest helped end the Vietnam War. This idea is an unquestioned article of faith in the liberal narrative of those times. But there's no empirical evidence to suggest this is true, and much to show it is false. A central aspect of the myth is that young people were almost universally opposed to the Vietnam War effort. This is not so. A May 1967 Gallup poll showed that pro-war hawks on campuses outnumbered doves 49% to 35%. And among draft-aged young men, the hawks had a 26-point edge. A July 1967 poll, conducted during the much-hyped Summer of Love, showed that 67% of young people wanted the military to finish the job in Vietnam, compared to only 28% who wanted a pullout. And these young people were in fact more hawkish than the national average. So why do people think the youth were against the war? You can blame it on effective information operations. Anti-war radicals skillfully dominated media coverage with their outlandish stunts. Would yippies really levitate the Pentagon like Abby Hoffman promised? It made for good TV, if nothing else, and good TV was all you needed. But such anti-war antics did nothing to alter Vietnam War policy. For example, November 15, 1969 saw the Washington, D.C. Moratorium March, part of a series of what were the largest anti-war demonstrations in history to that time. You could see it from the White House, but the president was unmoved. As far as this kind of activity is concerned, we expect it, President Nixon said of the student uprisings. However, under no circumstances will I be affected whatever by it. Nixon could safely ignore the marchers since a Gallup poll showed 77% support for his Vietnam War policies. Nixon was drawing down troop levels under the Vietnamization strategy. You'd think the radicals would be thanking him rather than calling him a war criminal. And by the way, documents captured from the Viet Cong showed that Hanoi had ordered attacks to take place in South Vietnam specifically to coincide with the planned moratorium marches, to show their support for the students. Because the communists are good at this kind of thing. They understand political warfare. If only we did. The public, then as now, had little tolerance for radical excesses and tend to support the authorities when they restore order. A recent Morning Consult poll shows 76% support for colleges asking the police to protect campuses from violence. Back in 1968, after Chicago police used brutal methods to deal with demonstrators outside the Democratic National Convention, another important touchstone in liberal history, a Gallup survey showed that 56% approved of the crackdown. And current Democratic leaders may well be expecting a replay of 1968-style protest at this year's Chicago Democratic Convention, but without a Mayor Daley keeping order. So for reporters looking for a news hook during the convention this August, there it is. I'm certain I'll be revisiting it. Even after the fatal Kent State shootings on May 4th, 1970, polling showed that 58% of Americans held the student demonstrators chiefly responsible for the tragedy, while only 11% blamed the Ohio National Guardsmen who pulled the triggers. 4 dead in Ohio remains an enduring refrain for the anti-war crowd, but Neil Young was no barometer of public opinion. We aren't seeing crackdowns like that now. It's noteworthy how law enforcement tactics, techniques, and procedures have evolved over 50 years. You don't see police out there swinging batons, using fire hoses and dogs, guardsmen with fixed bayonets, none of that. Training in crowd and riot control has become more sophisticated, professional, and widespread. There's more emphasis on crowd management versus control. Law enforcement officers communicate clear lines with protesters to let them know what's acceptable and what can get them arrested. Police utilize tactical intelligence to isolate and target ringleaders. They are trained in de-escalation techniques. Less lethal weapons are more available. And police have experienced public affairs officers shaping narratives for reporters, who are otherwise more than willing to go with the protesters' narrative. And incidentally, did you see reports of protesters not talking to the press? Amateurs. They should always talk. It's their primary weapon in political warfare. Well, except for the protester at NYU who confessed she really didn't know why she was protesting and said she wished she was more educated. Glad she's in college. Law enforcement has correctly diagnosed the situation with these encampments. The police know that the demonstrators want a violent reaction. They want the optics of the poor, bloodied demonstrator, of the heartless cop, the whole victimization routine. They want the specter of police brutality, an expression that got widespread use starting in the late 1950s and originally peaked in 1968 with Chicago. But the police aren't playing that game. They aren't part of that theater. So the demonstrators try to manufacture a reaction. They taunt, they push, they goad, they shout. If they're arrested, they go limp or scream they're being hurt, they can't breathe, or whatever. And when the police don't respond, the demonstrators come off looking bad. They don't look like victims or the peaceful, idealistic, moral leaders they imagine themselves to be. They just look like entitled troublemakers wasting their parents' tuition. Despite their best efforts, there are no enduring positive images emerging from this round of protests. There is no evocative photo that advances their narrative. No hippies putting flowers in gun barrels. Remember that one? Bernie Boston's Pulitzer Prize-nominated photograph, Flower Power, from the March on the Pentagon, October 21st, 1967. A turtleneck sweater-wearing performance artist who went by the name Hibiscus, whose real name was George Harris, put flowers into gun barrels of soldiers of the 503rd Military Police Battalion, Airborne. It was purely spontaneous, but one of those timeless images that today's protesters seek to recreate with their agitprop. So far, we haven't seen anything so effective. Incidentally, if you want to deal with tents, during that same Pentagon protest, a military helicopter coming into the landing pad swung out over the encampment and hit them with some downwash, blowing tents all over the place. This is hard to do at most campuses today, but you have to give that pilot credit for his sense of humor. Also, an eyewitness to this told me that when the tents blew off, it exposed a number of couples very busy getting a piece for peace. Because we know why guys get involved in this stuff, right? I mean, come on. On the other hand, Ronald Reagan said the make love not war crowd didn't look like they were capable of doing either. So now the country is facing a new series of well-organized, coordinated campus uprisings in support of, at least judging by the endless chanting, divestment, freeing Palestine, having an intifada, supporting Hamas, destroying Israel, and backing a broad menu of progressive social causes. None of these issues enjoy broad public support, and campus tantrums won't change that. There's no compelling reason for the public to be swayed by self-important, elite, mostly white young people throwing a fit. When you see African American law enforcement officers joyfully raising an American flag after having contemptuously disposed of a Palestinian banner erected by these privileged white radicals, you know the activists have lost the narrative. So what good are the protests? They won't lead to a ceasefire in Gaza, a Palestinian state, or make Israel vanish. They won't save Hamas, and won't free a single Israeli hostage, not that the protesters care. But the radicals can claim some victories. At Northwestern, Brown, and Rutgers, weak-willed progressive administrators caved to student demands, giving them most of what they wanted in the name of peaceful resolution of the situation, a crisis the demonstrators unilaterally created. So these administrators essentially rewarded the radicals simply for being radical, virtually guaranteeing further protests in the future. And the protests themselves, with their cult-like chanting, programmed rituals, people wearing masks and costumes, and endless self-righteousness, give impressionable students a sense of belonging. It provides meaning to their superficial lives, links them to a cause greater than themselves, encourages their tendencies to view themselves as the white messiahs standing up for the downtrodden. It is red meat for sanctimonious youngsters. And the terrorist training manuals and indoctrination sessions at the encampments show that this dynamic will keep rolling. So the main targets of the protests are not the policymakers or the public, and not even the school administrators. The targets are the protesters themselves. Campus rallies are a form of mobilization, indoctrination, and radicalization. The experience can induce long-lasting and harmful psychological effects. And once these impressionable kids are hooked on extremism, it will be hard to get them back. The organizers, funders, and outside agitators involved with this movement understand this dynamic very well. It is the reason they are doing it. We are watching them in real time mint the next generation of true believers to keep the myth and the revolution alive. Thanks for tuning in. If you like this podcast, please share and subscribe. For IWP, I'm Jim Robbins. Join us next week for another edition of the IWP Podcast.